All right. So, what I'm going to talk about and explain is a little bit about the implications of blockchains. So, what they can deliver for society and why people find them exciting. And to get to that, I'm first going to explain some aspects and features and compare what blockchains deliver to the existing infrastructure that we're accustomed to. So this first slide here is going to talk about what blockchains do in contrast to what the existing infrastructure does. So in banks, it's largely about trust and reputation, and in blockchains, things are automated and machine verifiable. So you get some kind of real-time assurance that the financial network built with the blockchain technology has, the books balance and everything has integrity after each transaction set is processed, basically. Whereas in the financial world, you get assurances maybe after an accounting period of a year or two. So failures risks can build up over longer periods of time, and that can create systemic risks. And in particular, one very interesting thing that Bitcoin introduced into the electronic cash technology sphere, other than being peer-to-peer and decentralized, which is very important, is this concept of mining. And I think there are different ways to look at it, but one interesting way to look at it is it presents an open market for audit services. So miners can fetch sets of transactions and validate them and do some work, which is an expenditure of resources, to mark their assertion that these transactions are valid. And if their assertions are incorrect, other people will cross-check them and reject them. So there is some kind of independently verifiable assurance that this is correct, basically. So it's partly an economic argument. These protocols are open and permissionless.
Do you want to forward to slide?
No. So they're open and permissionless, and tend to give faster innovation. So people credit the openness of the internet for the wave of innovation that came with it. And because blockchains are automated and don't rely on trust as much and reputation, there's a lower barrier to entry, and so we can, generally speaking, expect fees to be lower because we can get more competition. So next. So the other important factors are that we need interoperability. The finance network is very interconnected. So one of the interesting things about the assurances of a blockchain is you want those trust assurances to be independently evaluatable so that somebody can send you something and you can build something else. So if one person sends you an asset and says, okay, this is a share in something, you should be able to combine it with something else, make a new asset, like a structured product that builds on it, and have anybody else validate that. So you should be able to move assets around between chains. So you can think of a web of interconnected blockchains as something like internetworking, where on the internet we had sort of SSL encryption and so on, and you really want the encryption to be end-to-end so that security is preserved. So in blockchains you want trust to be end-to-end and preserved. And if we can move the world to this kind of technology, we should be able to reduce systemic risks, at least at the basic accounting level. Next. Next slide, please. So I think the blockchain maybe offers opportunities for early adopters. So looking at the internet as an example, some people dove in early. Digital Garage actually being an example of a company that took early and bold steps into new technology, and some people will adopt more slowly. And there are risks with that in the sense of a sort of Netflix versus Blockbuster kind of situation, that if you don't adopt and you get left behind, it's potentially a business risk. So other than sort of real-time audit and automated trust and sort of automated trust statements that you get from blockchains so that you can sort of, I mean, one of the things it gives you is a kind of bearer instrument. So normal financial ledgers are just databases maintained by banks, and your ownership of the asset is basically an IOU from the bank, whereas what blockchains tend to give you is a more tokenized bearer form of ownership. So you have a key, and you can spend the money, and generally speaking, there's nobody in charge or with authority who can stop you spending the money. So the other interesting feature that blockchains give or provide an implementation of, it was a pre-existing idea, is smart contracts. So I think smart contracts became more interesting with the sort of very cash-like bearer aspect of Bitcoin blockchains, so that when the contract executes, it's final. Now, what is a smart contract? So a smart contract is with Bitcoin transactions and other related technologies, when you have a coin, as well as having a private key with which you sign to authorize the transaction, there could potentially be a small program, and your task to spend the coin is to cause the program to return true. So if the program is a call option or something, you can say the program says that, well, if it hasn't expired and if the market price is above this, then you can exercise it, and this is what you get the difference in price or something. So that small program, rather than being a back office kind of EDI thing that gets run in a bank, becomes a part of this bearer asset. So it has rules and you can program it. So we can extend the kind of bearer electronic cash into bearer more complicated financial instruments with rules. And this is called smart contracts. It's interesting because there are less risks and more direct ownership. So if you think about a traditional financial instrument, a structured product, or a derivative, often if you go through the fine print, you're not directly the owner of it. It's, there's somebody underwriting it. If they go bankrupt, you may or may not get your money back. Whereas with a smart contract, it's maybe, there's a contract that explains some complicated rules, but it's built based on underlying commodities or assets, dollars or gold or Bitcoin or something. And as long as you have, those assets are directly connected to the smart contract, and you trust the custodian, if it's physical possession of a gold bar in a depository or something, then you don't have to trust the person who is executing the contract, because the contract is kind of self-executing. It's executed by the blockchain network. It sounds kind of like a narrow AI or something, but in practice it's simpler. It just means that everybody who relies downstream on the contract verifies for themselves that the contract rules were triggered and that you were the correct owner as a result. Next slide, please. Next. So one challenge with blockchains, which partly drives the discussion about private blockchains, is that public blockchains are great because everybody can audit it and get trust and assurance from it, but it's too public. So if you talk with people from the financial industry about the Bitcoin-style public blockchain, they get concerned that it reveals too much about their clients' trades or their own proprietary trading patterns or the prices people are paying for things. And so they actually want confidentiality. And so you might think as a starting point that there's a conflict there, that we want the public auditability to get public trust and system integrity assurances, but we want confidentiality. So some companies have sort of focused on private blockchains, i.e. blockchains that are inside firewalls, connected over VPNs, or maybe even just run within one company or within a couple of companies that are collaborating on something. So, but it turns out you can this problem is solvable. So it's kind of an analogy to perhaps how VPNs were adopted over time by banks to have a lower cost of operation. Rather than having a fixed leased line, you would just encrypt the traffic and send it over the open internet and get those benefits. So it turns out you can do this with blockchains. You can encrypt the values, so the price of the shares or the number of shares traded, those kinds of things, and yet still be able to audit the ledger characteristic. So the main ledger characteristic is that the books balance, that the assets that are being sold and the money that's being paid for them and the money that's changing hands, that nothing is getting created or destroyed. So the books balance at the end of each transaction. And it turns out you can encrypt values and still provide that assurance. So it works using a additive homomorphic encryption, which general homomorphic encryption is extremely inefficient and many orders of magnitude away from practical application. But single, additive homomorphism, which doesn't support other operations, is actually quite practical and efficient. So it turns out you can, have an encrypted order for 5,000 shares, another encrypted order for 3,000 shares, and those are sold to two different people, and you can see that adds up to the original amount of encrypted 8,000 shares. But everybody can get assurance of that by looking at the chain and running some simple operations, but they know nothing about how much money changed hands. Now, the other kind of interesting aspect about blockchains, which is a bit of a side effect, is that because it's cash settled and bearer, it's somewhat unforgiving. It has security properties that are a bit binary. If you lose the private key, somebody can take your money, and ledgers are usually, even today in financial systems, intentionally append-only. You can't modify them. And in fact, you probably experienced yourself, occasionally banks will make an error, and you'll see the error on your bank statement, and you'll see a correcting transaction, undoing it, and then a replacement transaction. So they never, by general accounting standards, edit transaction ledgers, and blockchains are the same. But in a blockchain world, if you have custody of your own keys, that can mean if you lose control of your keys, you lose the funds. So it is quite dependent on good security practices. So it's driving, applied research into improving those security practices. But ultimately, we can, replicate the existing custodian relationships and solve the security problems, I believe. So then on what else you can do with smart contracts, smart contracts are mostly a system for enforcing rules. So in general, as a society, we agree on a framework of rules, and it's more efficient for us to a priori enforce basic agreed rules than to technically, so that it's not possible to bypass them, than it is to reactively discover in an audit several years later that somebody bent some rules and then try to get the money back. Well, okay, maybe they don't have the money anymore, and then other people are impacted by the failure. So blockchains provide the prospect of preserving privacy and a priori enforcing societal rules about transactions. Next slide, please. So I was talking about the sort of building smart contracts and building assets from smart contracts that the effect we get is that we can replace a trusted issuer with a trusted instrument. So rather than having to trust the credit rating and solvency, long-term solvency of the issuer in order to buy an asset, we can just trust the custodians who hold the bearer assets and have an expert look at the contract. So that brings about the possibility for a longer tail of instruments to enter. So you could buy a multi-year term asset or smart contract that was issued by a startup that may or may not be around in 3 years, when the contract has a 5-year term. But it doesn't matter because you can have an expert look at the smart contract and you own the smart contract. So I think that should ultimately deliver competition and lower pricing. Because basically financial institutions have to build and maintain their trust and reputation, and that has a cost. And so they naturally are going to charge accordingly. And so it's difficult for somebody to start a new bank and catch up with the reputation of an existing bank. We can reproduce the custodian kind of models, so it's not that everything has to be cash settled. You don't want, your retirement plan in cash under under the mattress kind of thing. So you literally wouldn't have extremely large investment amounts under cash control. You would still be using custodians and so forth, but you would have more checks and balances, and maybe your approval is needed to transact. And we can also use the technology to reduce intermediaries. Some things can be done more direct, more peer-to-peer, and so that also reduces the cost. Each intermediary typically needs fees. And if we can re-architect and move the financial networks onto this technology, ultimately we should be able to reduce systemic risk. Next slide, please. So a couple of other final points. Scalability, so sometimes people talk about blockchains having scalability challenges, and there's some misunderstandings in the sense that there are different layers in blockchain. So the basic layer is a broadcast mechanism, so of course it tends to have sort of n-squared scaling properties, and that makes it challenging to have extremely high scale. But there are other layers we can use. So there is sort of caching layer, which has generally been described as Lightning or duplex payment channels. Payment channels have been around for a while in Bitcoin, but Lightning is a kind of more efficient, more modern implementation of that. So there's a lot of work going on with that now, and that allows much, much higher scale while preserving all of the Bitcoin properties or blockchain properties. So we can get to scale, and there are interesting technologies which are coming online which may make even more types of flexible scalability possible in the longer-term future, particularly these snarks, which are some kind of cryptographic signature of execution, which have a lot of interesting implications. So coming back to overall summary of what I was talking about, so I think what blockchains provide is more transparency, accountability that societally agreed rules are going to be a priori enforced, so that will be cheaper and more effective. And so I think regulators ultimately will like and appreciate smart contracts and blockchains in reducing the kind of compliance and sort of reactive after the fact effect we have today, where things have to go wrong before the regulator typically will find out, and by then it's often too late, and things have a knock-on effect because everything's interconnected. So we should be able to reduce some of those effects. And smart contracts are also providing secure automation, so moving the back office operations into a more direct ownership model, so less trust is required. We can solve confidentiality and auditability in parallel. It's been demonstrated. It's been running. A number of people have adopted this technology over the last year. It can be scalable, as we've just discussed. Interoperability is also very important and interesting, and ultimately possible that we can convey the trustless nature of a transaction. I think the mining aspect of blockchains is an important aspect for conveying trust across networks. So we'll see how that plays out versus private chains. I'm much more interested in public chains for their auditability. And ultimately, being able to program financial instruments will be very powerful for the future. So, thank you.